The scene opens in 949. It's approximately 100 years later. Abd al-Rahman III now has complete power over Al-Andalus, but make no mistake, his rise to power had its brutal moments, and the exhumed body of his greatest rival Umar ibn Hafsun, which was put on display, gives testament to that. And if not this, then one only has to look to the Gate of Al-Suda, which was an entrance to his pleasure city of Madinat al-Zahra, which served as a glorified place of execution, similar to England's Tyburn. However, the Emir, who now turned Caliph, had united Al-Andalus like never before. He ushered in a period where you had a booming economy, a military supremacy, and cultural ascendancy. This made Cordoba a rival with Baghdad and Constantinople as one of the most civilized places on earth. This, while most of his Western European neighbors didn't even use forks. His right-hand man and vizier during this high point was Jewish. Hasdai ibn Shaprut, the son of Isaac, was a Renaissance man before there was a Renaissance. He was born in Cordoba in 915 during a bright time for the Jewish community. The economy was good, and a frenzied trade throughout the Mediterranean was bringing in the latest innovations, music, fashions, and new ideas. The Jewish community embraced this and prospered. Maria Menachal in her book comments on this, quote, "Under the Dima brought by the Muslims, the Jews, who in Visigoth Hispania had been at the lowest end of the social and political spectrum, were elevated to the status of people of the book, alongside the Christians, for whom it was instead a demotion. This granted them the ability to participate freely in all aspects of civic life. This freedom meant virtually unlimited opportunities in a booming commercial environment." End quote. Menachal goes on to clarify the reason for their success. Quote, "Of course, at the heart of the Jewish community's prosperity lay an enthusiastic attitude about Arabization, which meant full cultural assimilation. The Jews' position under Muslim rule was in every respect an improvement as they went from persecuted to protected minority." End quote. Hasdai grew up in a Moorish Spain where education was not far out of the reach of most people. Indeed, the Jewish community was able to not only grow and add to their own cultural heritage, but were also able to contribute to the expanding Arabic libraries on philosophy, poetry, and science. Thus, the man spoke Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, Mozarabic, and came to the attention of the Caliph, who recognized his abilities, which included his elegance in speaking and writing, and who had a profound knowledge of Andalusian and Islamic culture. So, it's not surprising that he was quickly elevated to the high office of vizier. Now, in the year 949, the Caliph had enough faith and trust in the man that he placed him at the head of a delegation that met with a diplomatic envoy from Constantinople. They met in the Caliph's famed pleasure palace city of Madinat al-Zahra to discuss an alliance with the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. And while no military endeavor was agreed upon, there was still considerable amount of cultural exchange. The mosaics in the Great Mosque of Cordoba give a perfect example of this. But the Byzantine also gave Al-Andalus several books, including the manuscript of Dioscorides, which was called On Medicine. This was written in Greek, which was a bit of a problem as no one actually spoke it, despite being a polyglot society. However, the Eastern Roman Emperor also sent a monk translator to teach the caliphate, and before long, Al-Andalus was doing its own Greek translations. This was a particularly great present as Hasdai, who aside from being a philosopher, a diplomat, a vizier, and head of the Jewish community, was also, in his spare time, a doctor. And he specialized in antidotes to poisons, if you're wondering, which made him even more valuable to the Caliph. Shaprut was by no means alone in the medical field. Medicine was an advancing and developing field in Moorish Spain and was not just limited to a few people. The list is quite impressive, and their contributions to medicine are just extensive. Ibn Juljul was a physician who created a commentary on pharmacology, which was based on Greek works. Abul Qasim al-Zarawi was a court surgeon to Al-Hakam II who created an extensive work, and I'm talking 30 volumes extensive, on diseases known as the Khatib al-Tasrif. This man, by the way, in some circles gained the title the Father of Surgery. Abul Marwan ibn Zuhur, known in Latin as Avan Zoar, was the first to describe heart abscesses, and Ibn al-Khatib described how disease transmission happened through clothing and vessels and objects before there was any knowledge of viruses and bacteria. There were advances in hygiene, infectious disease, surgery, and even medical ethics. Institutions that we in the modern world would recognize as a hospital were established with separate wards for different diseases, surgery, recovery, pharmacies, and medical education. It was here that doctors recognized the infectious nature of things like leprosy, smallpox, sexually transmitted diseases, and later tuberculosis was added to this list, along with the need for quarantine. This was not bad for a medieval society, a society where Shaprut was proud of his native land. In one of his correspondences to the many foreign embassies that Al-Andalus conversed with, the great Jewish vizier wrote the following, quote, "It is a land of grains and wines, purest oils, rich in plants, a paradise of every sort of sweet, and with gardens and orchards where every kind of fruit tree blossoms. Our land has its own sources of silver and gold, and in her mountains we mine copper and iron, tin and lead, coal and marble. The king, ruling over the land, has amassed silver and gold and other treasures, along with an army the likes of which has never been amassed before. When other kings hear the power and glory of our king, they bring gifts to him. I receive those offerings, and I in turn offer them recompense." End quote. Word of Al-Andalus and its capital reached and inspired even those in the distant court of the Holy Roman Empire. These are the words of the nun Roswitha of Gandersheim, and she wrote this in 955. She was one of the VIP people in the higher circles of King Otto I. Quote, "The brilliant ornament of the world shone in the west, a noble city newly known for the military prowess that its Hispanic colonizers had brought. Cordoba was its name, and it was wealthy and famous and known for its pleasures and resplendent in all things." End quote. Conjure up in your mind for a second what you think of when you hear of medieval Europe around the year 1000. Now, compare that thought with this. The ornament of the world was a city that had her rival only in Constantinople and Baghdad. Her population at the turn of the millennia was nearly 500,000. And some estimates say as high as 1 million. And this at a time when Paris and London were lucky to number maybe 20,000. This was a pretty impressive city. It was said that there were 900 public baths, 50 hospitals, 100 mosques, including the Great Mosque. The streets were paved and lit by street lamps with enough lighting that its glow could be seen 10 miles away. There were impressive stone bridges and a series of aqueducts that would supply water to her inhabitants. And there were many public and private gardens that dotted the city. And by the time of Al-Hakam II, who loved books, there were 70 public libraries. Again, the Caliphal Library alone held 400,000 manuscripts. And remember, this was before the time of the printing press. It was here that scholars could congregate as they found common ground and patronage. It was in Cordoba, before the Crusades came into being, that you had philosophy that was debated. And not just Islamic philosophy, but Jewish, Christian, Greek, and side by side, mind you. It was here that astronomy was progressed, where you had people contesting an Earth-centric universe, and the astrolabe was developed. It was in this city where mathematics were advanced. Now, it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway because this really shouldn't come as a surprise, but these advances didn't just influence those who lived in what was regarded as the ornament of the world. "50 years later, in the year 999, lived a man named Gilbert of Aurillac. He was a monk with an ingenious mind who thought beyond the confines of his world. Chris Lowney, in his book, A Vanished World, talks about his humble beginnings. Quote, Gilbert of Aurillac was a genius of humble origins. Count Borel of Barcelona encountered the prodigy at the Benedictine monastery of Aurillac and, astounded by his intellect, took him to Spain for further studies. Gilbert took up residence at a monastery tucked in the Spanish Pyrenees, which was straddling the fault line between Islamic and Christian Spain. Its scholars undoubtedly recognized the intellectual superiority of neighboring Al-Andalus and did their best to gather its riches, turning their library into one of Christendom's finer centers of learning. End quote. While he was in Spain, he came across a book known as the Codex Vigilanus, which was a Christian manuscript made by a fellow monk who derived it from Al-Andalus, which got the information from the Islamic world's encounter with the Indian subcontinent. It gave an account of the Indian race, which had, and I'm paraphrasing here, a most subtle talent when it came to arithmetic and other mathematical arts. This book that he was reading contained characters that we would now recognize as our modern figures for numbers. That's right, 0 through 9 written down right in front of him, but this was shocking stuff. The Christian world was still using Roman numerals. I mean, imagine doing long division. Quick, what's CDL XXXVI divided by XXVII? It's XVIII, duh. These Hindu-Arabic numerals inspired the man. It made things too easy. He found himself being able to calculate complex arithmetic, at least compared to his contemporaries, in his head. 450 divided by 9 was 50. Done. Now, to put this into context, this man would go on to become the Pope. In fact, the first French Pope. He was known to history as Pope Sylvester, and he was credited with creating the pendulum clock and the pipe organ, but when he tried to get his flock to follow his lead with the new number system, it totally backfired. His awestruck companions couldn't understand how he could do such amazing math, quote-unquote, without having to write it down. They had, of course, no choice but to condemn him as an evil magician, and it didn't help that it was going to be the year 1000 and all of the end-of-the-world people were out in force. To his credit, he still tried to enlighten his community, but even on his death in 1003, his reputation for sorcery persisted. It was just too much for them to handle. Lowney gives us one explanation why this wasn't a success. Quote, "There is a more obvious explanation for Europe's glacial conversion to the system. Sad to say, it just wasn't much needed. Though Hindu-Arabic numerals greatly simplified mathematical computation, Europeans didn't have a whole lot of computing to do. Economies were moribund, urban life had collapsed with the Roman Empire, and feudal Europe puttered along, supported by subsistence agriculture rather than trade. There were no legions of busy shopkeepers, bankers, or merchants clamoring for advanced computational tools to track humming businesses." End quote. This was not to be the case in Al-Andalus. The Caliphate was still doing really well at this time. However, it was shifting from its cultural peak to its military peak. Indeed, Al-Mansur, who was the orchestrator of various book burnings, which, just as a side note, any type of time you have book burnings, it's always a sad sign for any civilization. Now, he had shown his military power by attacking Santiago de Compostela in 997, razing the city and taking the bells of the cathedral back to Córdoba. But the economy was still doing well and math was needed. The base 10 Arabic Hindu system simplified all of that. But the Islamic world didn't stop for just commercial pursuit. The mid-9th century mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, where the term a logarithm was derived from, was in the process of establishing quadratic equations and geometric proofs. In fact, his book, Al-Gubra wa il-Muqabala, is where we get the term algebra. Now, what made this particularly astonishing was that it was all written down. From the shopkeeping to the receipts, to the trade, to the higher-level equations, all of it. And this wouldn't have been possible unless there was the development of something that we all take for granted, a simple invention, paper. In 751, at the battle near Talas in present-day Turkestan, an Islamic army fought and defeated a Chinese one. The Chinese prisoners of war taught their captors how to create paper, and this spread through the Islamic world and hit Al-Andalus shortly thereafter. In fact, the caliphate adopted the new technology with such a vigor that in the city of Hativa, paper wasn't just created, it was manufactured, almost on an industrial scale. Such was the need. The existing system, which consisted of parchment or vellum, which was made on animal skins, was a time-consuming, expensive process that quickly went to the wayside. These new technologies, the number system, the equations, the abacus, the paper to write it all down, would eventually make its way throughout Europe. Merchants and traders in the emerging Renaissance that was coming, despite their reluctance that this was coming from a foreign source, recognized in the end that this was just too useful of a system to ignore. And how successful was this? Well, remember this question as you pull up your calculator app on your iPhone or Android or whatever it is that you use and see those Arabic Hindu symbols staring back at you.